voters something for nothing, and that's unfortunate. But of all the paper currencies of the major economies, the U.S. is in the most danger because we've had the reserve currency for so long, and so we have a more imbalanced economy than anybody else. We've been living off our ability to print money, and the reason that all the inflation hasn't destroyed our economy already is because we've exported it. We've convinced the world. We've convinced the Chinese and the Japanese and the Saudis to hoard our dollars and send us all their stuff. But when they wake up to the reality that they've been duped and they no longer want our paper anymore, they'd rather have their stuff, then the whole thing collapsed, and that's where we are. We're on the verge of that right now.
In a recent interview with Congressman Grayson, I talked to him about the fact, and I know you've been a big Ron Paul supporter, Peter, but we talked about the fact that because he's been pushing this bill on the other side of the aisle to audit the Fed. And of course, the Fed came out and responded that if that happened, that interest rates would spike, the dollar would drop, and this would be very harmful for Americans. Did that strike you as a strange response to an audit?
Yeah, I mean, what is they're basically threatening us. It's like, they're like little kids. It's like, well, if you spank me, then I'm going to set fire to the drapery. Why would auditing the Fed cause all this to happen? Now, maybe what they're saying is, well, if the world knew what we were doing, then the dollar would collapse, which means, well, then why are you doing these things? Why are you doing things that are so bad that if anybody knew about it, the whole dollar would collapse? I mean, doesn't that show you that there's a problem here? And they're trying to say, well, it's going to compromise our independence. Maybe they're saying that. Well, what independence? There's nothing left to compromise. If they actually were independent, they might, have a point. But the fact that they simply do the Treasury's bidding right now, it's a pretense. They're acting as an arm of the federal government. They're trying to reelect politicians. They're trying to artificially stimulate the economy. There's no independence left. So we might as well at least know what they're doing.
Is Ron Paul correct then, or I can use somebody like Jim Rogers who says the Fed is immoral and should be abolished? Should it be abolished, Peter?
Well, it's tough to abolish it because the question is what's going to replace it? There's that old saying, the devil you know. So I wouldn't abolish it unless I knew what it was going to be replaced with in advance. Probably a more realistic approach, and maybe an approach that I would try to pursue if I was to be elected to the Senate, would be to try to restore the Fed's mission to more in line with the reason it was originally created and give it more independence, but take away these mandates it has for economic growth or employment. And I would like to make it illegal for the Federal Reserve to buy any U.S. government debt. I don't want it to be an engine of inflation. If it wants to create money, let it back it by something tangible, or but not have it buy treasuries. In fact, when the Fed was first created, it was not allowed to buy Treasury securities. They had to amend the Federal Reserve Act later on to allow the federal government to buy Treasury securities, but initially they weren't able to. So I would prefer to get the Fed back to that role and get it away from the role of financing deficit spending in perpetuity. I want Congress, if they want to spend money on something, to go out and appropriate it. And if they want to borrow the money, find a private buyer. Don't rely on the Fed to buy it. Find somebody in the private sector that will lend you their money willingly.
When I interviewed Congressman Stearns recently, he talked about the White House beginning to want to give the Fed more power. It sounds obviously like you're concerned that he was as well. I think Congressman Grayson, I don't want to speak for him, but I think he would have concerns with that also. So it sounds like you're saying if you were in Congress, you would definitely want to halt any type of action to give the Fed more power and restrict it more.
Oh, yeah, look, we need to take power away from the Fed. The Fed created these problems. The Fed is the principal architect of this disaster. To reward them with even more power is not only is it ridiculous, but the more power we give them, the more damage they're going to do, as if they hadn't done enough damage with the powers they had. Imagine how much worse they're going to make it now that we're giving them more power.
In closing here, Peter, if people would like to support your campaign, either financially or want to volunteer, if you get to that stage where you actually announce you're going to run, because I know you've raised close to $1 million already, you're on the cusp of that. This has happened very quickly for you. How do they do that? How do they get involved in your campaign?
Yeah, people can donate right now. I mean, I have an exploratory committee. I'm accepting donations. We've raised over $900,000. I've already announced that if I don't run for whatever reason, I'm returning the contributions. So there's no reason to hold off and wait till I announce. If you want to support my candidacy, you can do it right now. And if I do announce, and probably will, I'd like to have over $1 million raised by the time I do it. That would be a pretty good message to send, and I think the reporters would take that seriously. And so right now you can go to my website, which is Schiff, shiftforsenate.com. Just my last name, shiftforsenate.com. And you can donate right online, or, you can mail a check to the address on the site.
I don't want to steal your thunder here, but you're so close to $1 million. You're on the cusp. If you punch up over $1 million very quickly here, will you announce you're going to run? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, it's not a question of if I hit $1 million, I'm going to announce. I would like to have over $1 million when I do announce, because I think that's also significant. So it's not like, I hit $1 million and all of a sudden I'm in. The more money I can raise, I think the more likely I am to run and the more likely I am to win, and the more seriously the media is going to take me. Because I'm going to have to raise a lot more than $1 million. I might have to raise $1 million 20 times.
Right, Peter, but these things, they tend to snowball. You get your first $1 million, people begin to go, wait, this is a real candidate, this is a viable candidate, then all the backers start to come in. So these things, in reality, they snowball very quickly.
And look, hopefully I can win. Look, you mentioned Alan Grayson. He's been a client of mine for 10 years. I contributed $2,400 to his campaign when he called me up and told me he was running. And, he'd never been in politics, and he got elected. I mean, I'm trying to get elected to a bigger seat, the U.S. Senate, but you can do it. A first-time guy can come in and win. I mean, I think we really need somebody in the Senate who's similar to Ron Paul in that respect, but in the U.S. Senate. And if I can get there, and maybe Ron Paul's son, Rand, can get there, we can make a difference. We can convince other senators. It's just the beginning. We can try to build a critical mass by convincing one senator after another to change. That they're going in the wrong direction. That the advice that they've been following, the advice of the Bernanke's, the advice of the Geithners, this is wrong. These guys don't know what they're talking about. We're just making the same mistakes over and over again, thinking that if we just stimulate enough, if we just blow enough air, we can reflate the bubble. Well, A, we can't do it, and B, why would we want to? If we know it's a bubble, why would we want to blow it back up? It's only going to burst again, only with a bigger pop.
Peter, and then I'll let you go. I was interviewing Gerald Celente recently, and he talked about 2012 being the year that it would really become the progressive libertarian movement. And I know some of your views fall in line with that philosophy. Isn't it the reality that that is going to be probably most likely the case? And you're sort of right in the center at this as you begin to run for Congress a little bit ahead of the curve?
Well, sure. Well, that's what I'm thinking. I'm looking at the 2012 elections and thinking, what can I do now to help influence the way those elections pan out? If I can win a Senate race now, if I can win a Senate seat in Connecticut, which is a Democratic state, if I can win it and put an R on that seat, but do it from a real conservative, libertarian type stance, really shrink government, anti-big government, sound money, running against the Bush wing of the party, kind of like the Goldwater running against the Rockefeller wing, trying to move the Republican Party, switch the Republican Party dramatically towards that wing, that maybe we can lay the foundation for more candidates come in, and government is the problem, the free market is the solution, somebody running to shrink government, to cut programs, to cut departments, and have a Congress that's committed to follow through with that.
Peter, I would keep telling you I'm going to let you go, and I promise this is the last question, but Charlie Munger talked recently, and I know you know this, but he talked about the need to pull these banking interests out of the government, but that these elite banking interests, you almost have to perform surgery, but that these interests did not want surgery, but that it would be better for the wider civilization to have this surgery performed, basically to remove these people. Isn't this movement what you're involved in and what Ron Paul is involved in, and everything you're talking about really ultimately not just to create a smaller government, but to remove these elite banking interests from the government?
Well, I think right now the bankers are controlling government. I mean, look at everybody who's making policy. They're all coming from Wall Street, from the banking center, and they're all serving their own interests. And they're serving to try to maintain this financial bubble economy. And as long as they're doing that, they're preventing a more viable economy from rising to take its place. So we need to let this happen. We need to have real interest rates. We need much higher interest rates, and of course, that's going to end the party for all these banks and investment banks, and a lot of them are going to fail, and we have to let them fail. And we can't let the politicians tell us that if we don't prop up these banks and preserve their big salaries and their big bonuses, that somehow the whole country is going to collapse. It's not going to collapse. We don't need these major banks. They're doing much more harm than good. Let them fail. Let these people find real jobs.
Thank you so much for joining us, Peter.
Thanks for having me on. Again, it's shiftforsenate.com if you want to support my effort to get into the U.S. Senate and retake America.
Thank you for joining us at KingWorldNews.com. Remember to tune in next week for another great show where we will have Rob Arnott, who manages $30 billion over at Research Affiliates. Also, remember to go to our Gold Plus page for exclusive weekly interviews with Ted Butler and Gatta, and the business page for Barry Ritholtz, author of Bailout Nation.